In this video, I want to speak about the sexual instinct, and the sexual instinct is probably the most important of all three instincts when it comes to sexual intercourse and sexual interactions. But it's also the most difficult and the most delicate video of this lesson, because thanks to our cognitive bias, we tend to hear what we want to hear, and we're filtering out what doesn't really fit. So I would really like you to ask you to be very careful in this video. Now, the self-preservation instinct is all about being alive, about staying alive, and the sexual instinct is about feeling alive. It's about feeling this life energy, this life force in us. So it's about going beyond what we already have. It's about going into uncharted waters. It's about seeking something new, about expanding our horizons. So clearly it's a completely different dimension than the self-preservation instinct, right? And people who have a strong sexual instinct tend to seek peak experiences. For most of them, sex has to be spicy. And they really have a maximalist approach to sex. Now, some people believe that people with a strong sexual instinct have a higher libido. Well, it is true that for most of the people with a strong sexual instinct, sex consumes a bigger part of their life than the other subtypes or the other instincts. And they may attach more attention to sex, but it doesn't mean that there's a higher sex drive, or at least there is no evidence for that. They tend to attach more importance to their sex drive, and they may be more prone to exaggerating or over-focusing on their sexual needs. And they're less likely to compromise if sexual needs are not met. I mean, for them it's actually unacceptable if their sexual needs are not met, and they don't want to compromise on it, so it can actually be a reason for marital distress and even lead to divorce. And people with a very strong sexual instinct basically feel that if there is no sex in the relationship, then it's just friendship and it's not a loving relationship. On the contrary, people who have a sexual blind spot, they may be equally unhappy with an unsatisfying sex life, but they're less prone to go to the extremes of really having difficult discussions about that. So as I already said, the sexual instinct is having the biggest impact on our sexual expression, and people with a strong or a dominant sexual instinct actually tend to overrate sex, as I already said, and they give too much attention to it. But they also may bring too much intensity, and they actually may believe that this kind of strong intensity is some kind of sign of some kind of superior sense of freedom and actually a higher level of development. But on the contrary, this too strong intensity is more a symptom of a lower level of development, because it is acting on a purely instinctual level in the bedroom. Now, on the other side, people with a repressed sexual instinct are more susceptible to give in to messages of sexual repression. They're more likely to self-sabotage their libido. And interestingly, also they may actually get some kind of sense of spiritual superiority out of that. So basically, both sexual dominant or sexual repressed may have a problem with this overrating or underrating of sex. But it's more difficult to notice that problem with the sexual repressed, because they're actually quite often not going to be aware that they have a problem with sex. They also don't want to see it. They're just going to say, no, I don't have a problem with sex, you have a problem. Now, interestingly, actually also the sexual blind may actually overrate sex. I mean, it's not that they all underrate sex. Some actually overrate it very similarly to the sexual dominant, but they do it in different ways. So in the lower ranges, somebody who is self-preservation dominant may actually just watch porn all day and just masturbate several times a day. And this is their way, this is their way to alleviate their suffering. Also, people who are social dominant and actually sexual blind may spend excessive effort on finding partners for some kind of BDSM play that is actually not going to include any sexual intercourse. Now, people who have the sexual instinct in the middle of the stack, what does that mean? Does that mean that they're healthier in terms of their sexual interactions, so they have a better sex life? No, that's not the case. The only thing is that they are definitely going to have the same types of distortions, and they will also use sex as a form of ego gratification, but they are less likely to underrate or to overrate sex in their lives. The first zone in the sexual instinct that Russ Hudson talks about is the attraction zone. And it's all about how we are attracted and how we follow these attractions, about how we attract others through broadcasting and presenting ourselves. It's also about competing, choosing, and discriminating. Now, I spoke already at great length about the influence of this zone in the lesson on flirting and seduction, because flirting and seducing is all about attracting. The attraction zone thus plays less of an importance actually in the sexual act or sexual intercourse itself, but we should not completely exclude it, of course. People who score high in this attraction zone, they seem to have something erotic. There's some kind of erotic side to everything they do, because they tend to use sexuality to attract other people. And also, people who score high in the attraction zone, some people say that they can actually enter a room, they can scan the place, and they can immediately see who they're attracted to and who they would actually like to have sex with. Now, the attraction zone also deals with our curiosity and idealization of our partner. And idealization has both positive and negative consequences. If we're looking in a relationship, idealization can be good, because if we think our partner is better than he or she is in reality, we're less inclined to leave that partner. But the downside is that we have a rather unrealistic view, and we may have unrealistic expectations from our partner. And the moment we see that the partner does not match these expectations and our idealized view, we may get very disappointed. Also in sex, this idealization can have a very positive role, because it's going to make the experience much more intense. And idealization also enhances our arousal. Basically, what happens when you're madly in love, or what Osho called rising in love, is that you somehow idealize your partner, that you see the divine in your partner. And that can actually help you in achieving a much stronger orgasm. This rising in love that I was speaking about, that Osho wrote about, it's basically trying to see the divine in a partner that you may have been with for a long, long time. Instead of seeing the flaws of the person you are with, just see the positive. Also here, of course, the downside with these idealizations is that the moment you see that you are only idealizing, the disappointment may be equally intense, and of course the shattering of our illusions can be very painful. The interesting thing is also that people with a strong sexual instinct do not only tend to idealize their partner, but they also tend to idealize the sexual act. And they may have some kind of romantic visions or views about sex and sexuality, and they can attach lots of emotions to it. And very often this can happen in a rather irrational way. Now, this idealization of sex and the sexual act makes them prone to some kind of idealized and even pornographic depictions that glorify the intense nature of sex. So, for example, consuming sexual body fluids or facials or squirting and so on. So this idealization of the sexual experience is also about feeling that there should be no boundaries, that there should be no limitations in sexual play. So people with a very strong attraction zone, they tend to believe that if you refuse something in sex, if you're not going after your desires, it's as if you are reducing the sexual experience. So clearly they have less inhibitions and less restrictions, especially if it's about kink or oral sex or anal sex or anything like that. or at least they have less inhibitions compared to other subtypes. Basically, people that are very high in the attraction zone, they may be more interested in new things, in leaving their comfort zone and being adventurous. The other thing about the attraction zone is that it's responsible for the craving and some kind of desire to possess or partner. Yet another thing about the attraction zone is that it is about being aware of what turns us on and what does not turn us on sexually. It's also about the desire to be desired. It's about knowing what makes us really attractive. And people who are very low in this attraction zone, they quite often don't know what it takes to be attractive. They just don't understand what is needed. The last thing that I want to say about this attraction zone is how we may confuse attraction for connection. When we're attracted to somebody, we may have this spark, but this spark is not a connection. It's basically a desire for a connection. It's the desire to seek a connection with that person, but it's not an emotional connection yet. But so for people who are very high in the attraction zone, this desire for an emotional connection is very important. And they're not just interested in the sexual act alone. I mean, it's not like the self-preservation instinct that is very much about the physiological aspect of sex. So people who are high in attraction zone normally require some kind of sense of connection with a partner, which is based on the attraction, before they can actually enter into a sexual relationship. The second zone of the sexual instinct is the exploration zone, and it's in charge of activation, going for it, living life on the edge, getting out of our comfort zone and breaking routines, shaking things up, doing something innovative, taking risks. So it's all about the things that give us a rush of adrenaline and things that make us feel alive. So what does this exploration have to do with sex? Well, very simple. Basically, it's about finding out what a new partner likes or not. It's about exploring the person, finding the magical buttons. It's about exploring if our long-term partner is actually in the mood for sex or not, if he or she is energized or not. So it all relates very much to foreplay. People who score very high in this exploration zone, they really like foreplay, and some may like the foreplay even more than this sexual intercourse itself. Because, well, once you have orgasm, that's it, then it's over. And the foreplay is really about trying to seek this connection, trying to find the other. Now, people who are scoring very low in this exploration zone are less interested in foreplay. So if we take, for example, the self-preservation dominant and sexual blind, they may think that foreplay is some kind of waste of their energy. Well, of course, they like when their partner is giving them a massage and is trying to connect with them somehow, but they don't really want to put in the energy themselves in an active way. People who are social dominant and sexual blind, they may be less energy efficient as a self-preservation dominant, but they're also not too keen on foreplay. Of course, foreplay is a very good way to connect with the other person, and they're willing to do it, but still they're going to be less engaged than somebody who is sexual dominant. Another important part of this exploration zone relates to the natural creativity and our spontaneity. So people with a strong sexual instinct tend to be more creative. They're more interested in trying new things, in experimenting, in playing in unconventional ways. So although people who are sexual dominant may have their favorite positions, they don't like to go for a routine. For them, sex is more spontaneous, it's more fluid, they're not waiting for the partner to take the lead. And they really like to initiate something if they feel like it. On the other side, people who are sexual blind, they may be more comfortable with doing the same old things. And especially if we're looking at the self-preservation dominant, for example, for them the main goal is to achieve orgasm. So the things that have proven to work well, why not repeat them? So people who are sexual blind or score very low in this exploration zone tend to be what we call sexually responsive and not sexually spontaneous. So they're less taking an initiative, they're more acting on the advances of their partner. So very often they tend to act less on their sex drive because they don't notice it. They just don't notice that it is there. And so if somebody who is sexual blind is also with a partner who's not too demanding in sex, the sexual blind person may actually start thinking that he or she doesn't need sex. Another important aspect of this exploration zone is related to the novelty and the hidden mysteries of sex. It's interesting that people who score very high on this exploration zone, they're always able to find something new, to find some novelty. Even if they have been in a monogamous relationship for 3 decades, they are still able to find something new. We're all curious about the unknown, but people who are sexual dominant are really fascinated by it. And as we will see later, the sexual 5 is the master in mysteriousness. Sexual blind people may have a more ambiguous feeling to this novelty, actually. I mean, they may feel a little bit bored by their own routines, but from the other side, they're not really exploring anything new. They're not really trying to do anything that they haven't done before. So they tend to be more content with their own boredom, you could say. Now, of course, for those that are sexual dominant, this kind of exploration and venturing into the unknown implies some kind of risky behavior sometimes, but that is part of what they consider to have this kind of fullest sexual experience. Now, a final thing about the exploration zone is about getting activated, because the sexual instinct is not about just expanding lots of energy, it's also about the ability for getting turned on and to get activated quickly. So when somebody who scores high in this exploration zone gets a feeling that they are desired, and when they read the subtle hints that their partner wants to have sex, then they can get turned on in just a few seconds or even minutes, even if sex is not on their mind. Sometimes just by thinking and putting their attention on their genitals, they can already create enough sexual desire. So people who score very high in the sexual instinct are not really prone to refuse sex to their partner because they're not in the mood. Because they can get in the mood pretty easily. If it's in the morning, the afternoon, the evening, doesn't matter, even in the middle of the night. If they are approached in the right way, and this is crucial, they need to be approached in the right way, they can get sexually aroused rather quickly. But again, the approach is very important. If you have a partner who's sexual dominant and you just say, I would like to have sex now, that's not going to really arouse them. So finally we get to the third zone of the sexual instinct, and this is the merging zone. So what is merging? Well, instead of two people relating to each other, merging seeks some kind of temporarily amalgamation of the souls into some kind of union where the individual no longer exists. Instead of connecting and relating, it's trying to become one. It's seeking a fusion. It's transcending the individuality and the own self. So this is why people who are very strong in this merging zone very often want to create some kind of bubble, and they don't want anybody or anything to interfere and to come in between them. It also means that people who score very high here tend to be extremely jealous and very, very possessive, because they want the other to be part of themselves. They basically want to fully absorb the other person. They want to fully consume the other. And now this consuming of the other is both figurative and literal, actually, because people with a very strong sexual instinct actually are more likely to consume or swallow sexual body fluids. Of course, we should not generalize, because people who have sexually repressed views or believe that certain acts are degrading are not going to do so. The possessiveness also has a big impact on masturbation. So if somebody who scores high on this merging zone, or even in general high on the sexual instinct, if this person finds out that their partner is masturbating, it's going to feel to them as if their partner is abandoning them, as if the partner is cheating on them. It's as if the partner is refusing them to give a chance for feeling this state of merging of the souls. Another interesting thing is that this merging actually requires the absence or the dissolution of boundaries. And that has a big impact on the approach to condoms, because, I mean, everybody hates condoms, but for the sexual instinct, it's even stronger, because basically a condom creates some kind of barrier. It doesn't allow them to create a connection that they're seeing. So pretty often people who are sexual dominant can actually feel hurt or offended if their partner is actually suggesting them to use a condom. To them, it's as if having sex with a condom is as if you're together with somebody you shouldn't be with, as if it's just an ordinary hookup, and is as if there's no such special connection that they're seeking. And in the extreme, you may even hear about people who somehow subconsciously feel that if they were to contract a venereal disease, that would actually show the quality of the connection, and it would show how far they are willing to go to create this bond. So this really shows the irrationality actually of the sexual instinct. Now, another very important aspect of this alchemical merging is the necessity for losing oneself. It's the ability to surrender to the act, the ability to transcend themselves. Now, people who score very high in this merging zone have actually less problems in letting go, in surrendering. Basically, they can forget much more easily about the world around them. They're much more here and now. And they can also much more easily fully immerse into the experience and forget everything that's around them. So this may actually seem a little bit irrational to people who are sexual blind, but it's actually something very important, because this ability to surrender is some kind of prerequisite to the orgasm. And this is also why people who have a strong sexual instinct, and especially who are very strong in the merging zone, actually have less problems in achieving orgasm. Now, again, here we should not generalize. It does not mean that they don't have any problems at all. They can still have sexually repressive views, and they may have traumatic experiences in the past that are going to be an obstacle in this, and that may create a challenge. Another important thing to understand about this desire to merge is this kind of romantic drive to temporarily relinquish one's psychological boundaries through this kind of sexual excitation and release. Basically, the implosion of boundaries creates or can create the impression of going through a spiritual experience, of merging with the universe. And this approach to a highly intense emotional connection is basically an attempt of the sexual instinct to transcend the material world. So basically, people with a strong sexual instinct often try to seek mystical and transcendental experiences. So the goal of sex for them can be to feel the sense of union, to experience oneness, to get in touch with the holy origin. And this can actually explain why many people with a strong sexual instinct are very interested in tantric sex, because it helps them in their attempts to transcend the normal everyday life. But calling this a spiritual experience is a little bit far-fetched in my opinion, and it looks very much like spiritual bypassing, because the point is that people with a strong sexual instinct are often seeking a spiritual experience just because of an absence of being in touch with the spiritual nature that we all have inside of ourselves. So very often it's more some kind of imitation of a spiritual experience. Now, this doesn't mean that sex cannot be a spiritual experience. It can be, for sure. But if we're looking actually at human history, sex and spirituality have always been linked. Because sex is basically the source of life. And basically in how in the past sex was celebrated in spirituality, it was all about praising the reproductive power of nature. But people with a strong sexual instinct are not focusing on the reproductive nature of sex. They're more focusing on this intensity, and they somehow confuse this emotional intensity with spirituality or mysticism. True spiritual growth doesn't come through tantric sex or through some kind of transcendental sexual experiences. It's not about emotional intensity. On the contrary, real psycho-spiritual growth comes from our capacity of relating to one another in a compassionate and a caring way. Now, it doesn't mean that tantric sex is bad. No, not at all. If you like it, fine, go for it, but just don't let yourself be fooled and think this is some kind of spiritual tool. And actually, I would say that for people who are sexual blind, it may actually be very useful to try tantric sex. It may not be appealing, but at least it's a good way of working on your blind spot. Now, you may remember from your classes in chemistry that every chemical reaction needs a lot of energy. And this also relates to the alchemical approach to sex. The sexual instinct doesn't care about how much energy is needed in the sexual act. It's as if there is no tomorrow. As long as we can get closer to our object or the person of our attraction, we are willing to spend as much as we want. So there's some kind of irrational approach to resources and energy, but that doesn't matter for the sexual instinct. Now, this whole gushing out of energy translates itself into passion and intensity. So for people who are sexual dominant, the more intense, the more it's going to enhance this emotional state, and the more they're going to feel that this is how the sexual experience should be. Sometimes they can actually even be addicted to this kind of emotional intensity of the sexual connection. And sometimes they can actually feel as if the intensity is not strong enough. So they can actually get bored if they feel that it's not strong enough, or if they feel that their partner is not sharing their desire for intensity. And when they feel that, they may actually start looking for other ways of experiencing this intensity, and it can be either through finding another partner, or it can be through something completely different. They can go bungee jumping, for example. Now, the question of intensity is extremely important in sexual interaction. People with a sexual dominant instinct tend to overdo this intensity, and they somehow believe that this is how sex should be. They may bring in too much irrationality, and they may let go control entirely. They may just let the energy flow out of their system. And yes, they have less inhibitions and restrictions, but they may just be too intense, and sometimes it may not be nice for a partner who is sexual blind. Now, because these people who have a repressed sexual instinct, they actually have difficulties handling intensity. They're unable to let the sexual energy leave their body because they're too much in control of it. So they basically don't get this whole thing about intensity. I mean, to them it looks irrational. And so basically for people who have a sexual repressed instinct, their sexual act is more going to look a little bit contained, actually. So the problem is when we have a couple where one person is sexual dominant and the other one is sexual blind, because the sexual blind is going to find the other, is going to think that the sexual dominant partner is somehow irrational and that this intensity is not appropriate. And the sexual dominant person is going to think of the sexual blind person as being somehow boring and passive. And this intensity is not the same for all the types. Intensity is going to be different for all the different 9 types. So let's maybe talk for a few minutes about how each type experiences this intensity. But of course, it's very important to always see this issue of intensity in combination with the sexual instinct. Now, ones tend to have rather sensitive bodies, and they can actually enjoy roughness to a certain extent, but they have in their mind very clear boundaries and very clear limits of what intensity they can bear and what they cannot, and they're going to be very outspoken about that. Type 2 is very different. 2s are very disconnected from their body, and actually in the beginning of a sexual relationship they may falsely believe that a high physical intensity is an indicator of a strong emotional connection. But then later on in the relationship, and as the emotional connection grows, they actually need a higher arousal in order to tolerate a high physical intensity. So later on in the relationship, they're not able to cope with such a high level of intensity. Type 3. 3s are very much connected to their body actually, and they have a rather high tolerance for roughness. But their limits seem to be mainly based on the cultural and the gender norms, and what, let's say, is expected to be bearable, but not about what they personally can cope with physically or what they physically like or not. 4s are also very connected with the body, and they can have an extreme high tolerance for physical and emotional intensity, especially if they have a strong emotional connection with the partner. And this physical intensity gives them a real emotional rush, and this is actually why some 4s may be very interested in even painful BDSM. We'll talk about that later. Now 5s are very different because 5s tend to be very disconnected from their body. So the combination of this disconnection of the body but simultaneously being very sensitive is going to lead to a low tolerance for roughness as a receiver. But they can actually have a high tolerance for physical intensity as a giver. Now the sexual 5 may be a little bit different because they may actually like physical intensity very much as a way of getting into their body. If we move on to type 6, type 6 shares quite a few similarities with type 1 because they actually don't have a very high tolerance level. I would actually say that 6s have a very low tolerance level. But similar to type 1 is that once the limit has been reached, the arousal just shuts down. Interestingly, 6s may actually fantasize or watch porn which is physically very intense, basically to compensate for their own inability, for their own failure of coping with this intensity. But interestingly as well is that when a 6 is prepared and knows in advance exactly what is going to happen and how much intensity there is going to be, and if they are with a partner they trust, then they will be open for it. 7s are also quite connected to the body, but they can also be quite sensitive, just like 5, 6, and 7. And they also have a rather low tolerance level for roughness. Basically, 7s like the playfulness and the energy of intensity, but as long as it does not create any kind of physical pain. They like it. So basically 7s like adventures, but they don't like the harshness. but still their tolerance level for physical intensity is much higher than that of types 5 and 6. 8s have a very high tolerance level in terms of energetic intensity for just anything they do. Even the sexual blind can be able to cope with lots of intensity. So contrary to some other types, it's very difficult to intimidate an 8 through too much intensity. Because the other thing is that 8s actually tend to be physically desensitized, so they really need a lot of intensity to really feel something. And then the final type is type 9. They tend to be disconnected from their body, but they have a very high tolerance. But contrary to types 2 and 4, who can immediately get into some roughness, this needs to be built up gradually for type 9. Now, of course, type and instinct are not the only parameters that are going to determine the attitude towards intensity and physical roughness, because also, for example, childhood experiences that involved some kind of violence from parents and caretakers can actually lead to some kind of desires to reenact these experiences and really have something with high physical intensity. But I'll be talking about this more in the lesson on BDSM.